Would you accept watching half of your paycheck disappear into rent before you even buy a single grocery bag, standing in line at a food bank next to people who have full-time jobs, and still being told that everything is fine because the headline economy looks strong? In Canada right now, that is not a worst-case scenario. It is the daily reality crushing tens of millions of people from coast to coast. A nationwide cycle of financial exhaustion is underway. Shelter costs have surged by 26% since 2021. Food prices are now 27% higher than they were 5 years ago. And nearly 1 in 4 people across the country is living with food insecurity. The financial strain, combined with stagnant wages and a housing market that refuses to cool down, is triggering a burnout and despair epidemic, pushing food bank visits to an all-time record of almost 2.2 million in a single month. Is it possible that Canada, long seen as one of the safest and most prosperous countries on earth, has quietly turned into a machine that extracts every dollar of stability from its own citizens? Join me on this deep dive as we expose exactly how this is happening, province by province, and why so many Canadians feel like they are working harder than ever just to fall further behind. Let's start with the brutal truth about housing, because this is where the entire crisis begins. Owning a home in Canada was once considered a basic milestone of adulthood. Today, it has become a financial impossibility for an entire generation. Home prices across the country rose by more than 355% between 2000 and 2021, while median incomes climbed only about 113% in that same window. That gap is not a coincidence. It is a structural failure. The Parliamentary Budget Officer found that 2.4 million Canadian households are now living in what is officially classified as core housing need, up from 1.74 million when the National Housing Strategy first launched. And that number is projected to keep climbing toward 2.6 million within the next year if nothing changes. For renters, the picture is just as grim. The lowest income households in this country are now spending 66% of their disposable income just on shelter, a number that has exploded from 49% only a few years ago. When housing alone eats 2/3 of what you bring home, there is almost nothing left for anything else. And that is exactly the trap millions of Canadians are stuck in right now. Even the supposed relief in the rental market does not actually help the people who need it most, because while average rent growth has slowed to around 3 to 3.5% this year, vacancy in the truly affordable segment remains close to zero, meaning the cheapest units, the ones low-income families actually need, are still essentially impossible to find. Ontario remains one of the most punishing provinces, with average home prices sitting near $878,000 and average rent hovering around $2,350 a month, numbers that simply do not match what the average paycheck can support. Quebec tells the same painful story on a different timeline, with the average home price climbing from under $50,000 in 1980 to well over $400,000 today, a price multiple that has roughly doubled relative to income in just the last few decades. And here's the cruelest twist in this entire system. Only about 2% of Canada's total housing supply is genuine social housing, an almost non-existent safety net compared to other wealthy nations, which means when the private market fails you, there is barely a backup plan waiting to catch you. CMHC itself has stated that the country needs somewhere between 430,000 and 480,000 new housing starts every single year just to restore affordability by 2035, yet in 2025, the country only managed around 259,000 starts, which means Canada is falling further behind its own target with every passing year instead of catching up to it. And it's not simply a matter of building more units anywhere. The stock of dwellings per person has actually risen over the past 50 years, climbing from roughly 290 units per thousand people back in 1971 to about 403 units per thousand people today. And yet prices kept climbing anyway, which tells you this crisis is not purely about supply. It is also about speculation, investor demand, and a financial system that increasingly treats housing as an investment vehicle first and a place to live second. 42% of Canadians are now spending more than 30% of their income on housing, the exact threshold statistics Canada uses to define financial stress, and two-thirds of people relying on government income supports say those supports are simply not keeping pace with the real cost of living anymore. This is the quiet mechanism by which an entire middle class gets hollowed out, not through one dramatic crash, but through years of incremental squeeze where the rent climbs a little every single year while the paycheck stays exactly the same. But the extraction does not stop the moment you lock your front door, because once you step outside to buy groceries, Canada hits you with a second wave of financial pressure that is just as relentless as the first. Grocery prices have risen more than 30% since 2019, and a family of four is now expected to spend over $17,500 on food this year alone, according to Canada's Food Price Report. Coffee alone jumped about 30% in a single year. This is not a story about people buying lattes irresponsibly. This is a story about the basic cost of staying fed climbing faster than wages can possibly keep up. And the food bank numbers prove just how serious this has become. Food Banks Canada's Hunger Count report recorded nearly 2.2 million individual visits in a single month, the highest figure ever documented in this country's history, and that number has effectively doubled in just 6 years. Nearly a third of everyone walking through those doors is a child. Think about that for a moment. In one of the wealthiest nations on the planet, hundreds of thousands of children are relying on food banks just to eat. Even more disturbing is the rise in working households needing help. The share of two-parent families with children using food banks has climbed from under 19% to 23% in just a handful of years, which means having a job, even having two parents working, is no longer a guarantee that your family will not go hungry. 40% of food bank users are on social assistance or disability supports, meaning the very safety net designed to catch people is instead funneling them straight into food lines. This is the part nobody wants to admit out loud. Food bank usage is not a sign of laziness or poor choices. It is a direct mathematical consequence of rent eating your paycheck before food even gets a chance. But the financial bleeding is only half of this national crisis, because what's happening to the mental health of everyday Canadians right now is just as alarming, and it is being fueled by exactly the same pressures. 69% of Canadians report experiencing burnout symptoms within just the past 12 months. 21% of employed Canadians describe their work-related stress as high or very high, and the single biggest driver identified is simply heavy workload, the kind of relentless overtime culture that has become normalized just to keep up with the cost of living. Nearly 4 in 10 employees, 39%, say they feel burnt out right now, a number that keeps climbing year over year instead of improving. 1 in 2 employees is dealing with some kind of mental health challenge personally or through a close family member, yet most are terrified to disclose it at work for fear of how they will be treated. Even when people do reach out for professional help, the system is failing them on the back end too, with 56% of Canadians who accessed mental health support saying they left care earlier than they actually needed to, often because of cost, wait lists, or simply running out of capacity to keep showing up. 1 in 5 Canadians admit to turning to alcohol, drugs, gambling, or other harmful coping mechanisms just to manage their stress levels. The economic toll of all this is staggering. Mental health challenges are now estimated to cost the Canadian economy $180 billion every single year, with employers alone absorbing roughly $110 billion of that burden through disability leave, lost productivity, and workplace accommodations. Public sector workers, the very people running our hospitals, schools, and emergency services, report the highest burnout levels of any sector in the entire country. When the people holding up the system are the ones closest to breaking, that should be a 5-alarm warning, not a footnote in an annual report. This relentless pressure does not stop with working adults either. It is actively destroying quality of life for seniors and young people at the exact same time, just through different mechanisms. Seniors on fixed incomes are increasingly forced to choose between heating their homes and buying groceries, with retirees turning to food banks in numbers that would have been unthinkable a decade ago, simply because a fixed pension cannot keep pace with rent that climbs every single year, regardless of what their income looks like. For a senior living on a government pension or modest retirement savings, a 5% jump in rent is not an inconvenience. It is a direct threat to whether they can afford their prescriptions that same month. Young Canadians, meanwhile, are delaying every single milestone that used to define adulthood: buying a first home, starting a family, even moving out of their parents' house because the math simply does not work for an entry-level salary anymore. The average home price to income ratio has become so distorted that an entire generation is being told, implicitly, that homeownership is something that happened to their parents, not something available to them, no matter how hard they work or how many hours they put in. Students face their own brutal version of this trap, juggling part-time jobs around full course loads just to afford a shared apartment in cities where rental vacancy in the affordable segment is sitting at essentially zero. Many students report skipping meals toward the end of the month once rent and tuition payments clear their account, not because they mismanaged their budget, but because there was simply nothing left to manage. Grades slip not because students lack ability, but because survival has quietly become a full-time job layered on top of their education. And campus food banks across the country, once a rare and occasional service, have become a routine weekly stop for thousands of students just trying to make it to graduation without going into unmanageable debt. This is what makes the crisis so insidious. It doesn't just hit one demographic, it moves through the entire population, hollowing out security for the youngest and the oldest at exactly the same time, simply through different pressure points. And now we arrive at the most visible and most heartbreaking symptom of this entire crisis: homelessness. Because when housing, food, and mental health all collapse at the same time, this is where people ultimately land. The most recent national point-in-time count recorded 65,000 people experiencing homelessness on a single night across 75 communities nationwide, a number that researchers describe as 59% higher than it was just a few years earlier before stabilizing slightly. In Ontario alone, the most recent estimate puts the number at 85,000 people without a home over the course of a year, with nearly 2,000 encampments now scattered across the province, up 8% from the year before. Indigenous peoples remain catastrophically overrepresented in these numbers, making up roughly 30% of the homeless population while representing only about 5% of the general population, a gap that exposes deep and uncomfortable failures in this country's housing and social systems. On-reserve housing shortages affect roughly 40% of First Nations households, which means a significant portion of this crisis traces directly back to chronic underinvestment in Indigenous communities, pushing families to migrate toward urban centers that are themselves already overwhelmed. Toronto alone continues to record the highest concentration of homelessness anywhere in the country, and Canada's Northern Territories see homelessness rates roughly 3 times higher than the national average, a fact that rarely makes headlines but reflects some of the most extreme housing precarity anywhere in the developed world. Roughly 41% of people experiencing homelessness in Canada also struggle with a substance use disorder, frequently co-occurring with untreated mental health conditions, which means the homelessness crisis and the mental health crisis are not two separate stories. They are the same story wearing two different faces. Experts are now drawing a direct line between rising food bank visits and a coming wave of housing loss, warning bluntly that when food bank numbers climb, homelessness almost always follows close behind, sometimes with a lag of only a few months. The estimated annual cost of homelessness to Canadian society sits somewhere around $7 billion. Money spent reacting to a crisis that earlier investment in affordable, supportive housing could have prevented in the first place, since government data shows supported housing costs roughly half of what emergency shelter costs per person per year. So here's the uncomfortable question hanging over this entire country right now. Why does Canada continue to be seen globally as a symbol of stability and opportunity while millions of its own residents are quietly being ground down by the exact same systems that are supposed to support them? The answer is the same painful duality you see in every major economy under pressure right now. For those with existing assets, multiple properties, or high-paying stable careers, Canada remains a genuinely good place to build a life. But for renters, newcomers, students, and anyone relying on a single paycheck, this country has slowly transformed into a structure that demands more and more labor in exchange for less and less security. The real danger here is not just personal hardship, it's systemic fragility, because when nurses, teachers, retail workers, and tradespeople can no longer afford to live near the communities they serve, the entire social fabric holding cities together starts to fray at the edges. So, what would it actually take to fix this? 3 structural shifts need to happen immediately. First, a massive and sustained investment in genuine non-market social housing, because relying almost entirely on private developers to solve an affordability crisis has clearly not worked. And 2% social housing stock is nowhere near enough for a country this size. Second, income supports and minimum wage frameworks need to be tied directly to actual regional cost of living, rather than flat national figures that ignore how dramatically expensive cities like Toronto and Vancouver have become compared to smaller communities. Third, mental health care needs to be treated as essential infrastructure, not an optional benefit, with real investment in keeping people in treatment long enough for it to actually work, instead of losing more than half of patients to drop out before they ever get better. When a country quietly normalizes its own citizens skipping meals, sleeping in encampments, and burning out at record rates while insisting that the fundamentals are strong, that is not resilience, that is a warning sign being ignored. Canada is not just a story about one nation's economy, it is a mirror for what happens when wages stop keeping pace with the basic cost of staying alive in your own country. If this video resonated with what you or someone you know is currently going through, please hit like so this message reaches more people who need to hear they are not imagining this crisis and they are not alone in it. Share this with anyone who has ever felt like they are working harder than ever just to stay in the same place financially. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so we can keep uncovering the realities hiding behind the headlines together. Every single interaction helps us keep digging into the stories the system would rather you not think too hard about. The information in this video is compiled from publicly available economic data, government reports, and nonprofit research up to June 2026. All content is intended for general informational and analytical purposes only, presenting an objective overview of socioeconomic conditions in Canada. This is not financial advice, legal advice, or personal guidance on housing, employment, or relocation decisions. Any decisions related to your finances, housing, or well-being are entirely your own responsibility, and we encourage anyone struggling with financial hardship or mental health challenges to seek support from qualified professionals and local resources available in their community.